So hopefully if you're watching this presentation, you are responsible for your organization's website, or at least you're responsible for the latest redesign of it. Your job is to make it happen, to get the website out there, up and running and working. Now, this presentation is designed to challenge you, to challenge some of your preconceptions about how this project should be run and what the long-term consequences of that are. I'm going to explore project managing for the web. Now, know what you're thinking, not the most sexy of subjects, is it really? I'm sure there's a lot more interesting things that we could be talking about, but I hope by the end of this presentation you will be fundamentally challenged about how you see the nature of the web and how you see it as being managed. And hopefully you will go away excited and enthused about trying some different approaches, because I tell you what, project management may not be sexy, but if you get this right, if you manage this project correctly, you will create a phenomenally successful website. You see, the thing is that the web has changed everything. It's a new playing field, a new game, and we need to bring different thinking, new thinking to this new medium if we are going to do things effectively. And that cuts across all kinds of thinking, from strategy, but also project management. And it's this subject of project management that we're really going to dive into particularly, and say, what new thinking do we need to bring to project management in order to work with this new medium? And I think before we kind of do that, we need to first of all look at traditional project management, don't we? We need to look at what we're doing now and what particular aspects of that might be falling short. So first of all, let's look and define what we mean by traditional project management. Most project management, I think, falls into kind of four areas. First of all, you define the specification, don't you? You outline what it is you're going to do, what functionality you need, what content you need, that kind of stuff. Secondly, you define your budget. How much is this going to cost the organization based on the specification you've got? Third, you establish what resources and what people you need in order to achieve that objective. And then finally, you define your timelines. How long is this project going to take? When's it going to start, and when is it going to end? So let's look at each of these in a little more detail. We'll start by defining the specification. Okay. Now, how does this normally work? Well, normally what you do is you put together a big list, don't you? A list of functionality and content that you want on your new website. And you know that the items that you write on that have to consist of things that you've identified that you need, but also that you need to predict a little further ahead, up until the next time you do a website redesign. So what you're hoping is that the specification that you produce will not only work for today, but will work for the next 2-3 years. And so you're kind of predicting what might happen over the next few years, because you want the shelf life of your website to last as long as possible. And it's not surprising you want to do that, because when it comes to defining budget, you'll quickly realize that redesigning a website is quite an expensive process, and it is probably money that you're not naturally budgeted for as part of your ongoing costs. After all, this only seems to happen every 2 or 3 years you do a redesign. So that money has to be found, it has to be budgeted against this project, and you need to know that project is going to last you for a few years before you have to redo this process all over again. So you set your budget, don't you, based on the functionality that you have. Now, you might calculate that budget on the basis of going out to tender and getting different organizations to quote for how much it will be, or alternatively you might be doing it in-house, and so you'll need to put some costs against the time of different people working on this project. And that brings us on to defining your resources, doesn't it? A team has to be assembled to do this. Now, depending on how you're organised internally, it may be that you need to draw people in from different departments. That's quite normal, actually. A designer may be drawn in from print, a developer from IT. You have to find a project manager from somewhere. You maybe have to get content editors from comms or marketing or something like that. And you kind of assemble your team together. No doubt you may have some shortcomings as well, so therefore you have to decide whether you're going to try and do this project entirely internally or whether you're going to outsource some of the work that you do. So a team has to be assembled, a mixture of people from different departments and maybe even external agencies as well. And then finally, you have to create your timeline, don't you? How long the project is going to take. So you define a start date and an end point. Now, the start date is normally defined, as your prediction of once you've been able to sign contract with external providers and get the team together and all the rest of it. And your end date is not often based either on a specific milestone that has to be met, like you're doing a rebranding exercise and the new branding has to be done by a certain date. Or you've got an event coming up that defines your endpoint, or alternatively, it's a fairly arbitrary date just based on the kind of quotes of how long people think that this project will take. So you define your timeline, don't you? And then essentially this whole process rinses and repeats every few years. You have a new redesign process probably every 3 years, seems to be roughly what is fairly common. And in between, there's a relative period of inactivity. So effectively, you've got these periods of redesign where you're replacing the existing website, usually in its entirety, although not always, and that every 3 years or so, you've got significant capital outlay to, redesign the website and to pay an external contractor or to enable internal staff to work on it. So that's kind of traditionally how web projects have been managed, and the reason they've been managed that way is because traditionally that's how most projects in large organizations are managed, and we've just kind of taken previous project management methodologies and applied it to the web. So what's my problem with all of this? Why do I feel that this kind of approach doesn't work on the web? Well, the first thing to say is that the web requires cross-discipline and cross-departmental communication. And that's very hard in the kind of project structure that I've just outlined. You see, the thing is this how it normally works. You've got all those different people that I mentioned, and this isn't a complete list by any stretch of the imagination, but it's just to give you an idea. And these are all in different teams and different parts of the organization. So there are kind of these departmental barriers between each of them. And we know what large organizations are like. They don't necessarily communicate as well between departments as they should do. So what happens is a PM somewhere sits down and writes the specification based on stakeholder feedback as what it is that we want to produce. And he defines the budget and the timescales and all those kinds of things. Then what he does is he turns that specification over to a designer, and the designer does all these pretty mock-ups that kind of capture the look and feel of what the website's going to be like. And what different pages are going to be like and how they're going to operate, what the home page is going to be like, what the About Us page, you get the kind of idea. And then that gets approval, doesn't it, from the stakeholders, and everybody nods wisely and agrees that that's what we're going to produce. The designer, on the other hand, is sitting there going, well, actually, I've got some better ideas in terms of what we could have done on this website, but the specification has already been agreed and signed off by the project manager, and so I don't get to bring my expertise to bear in this situation. So he produces his templates anyway, and then he passes them across to the developer, who's probably in IT. Now the developer sits down and looks at these set of templates and kind of puts his hand in his head and starts sobbing, because he knows that actually what they suggested to be produced can't be done in the timescales or the budget that the project manager originally produced. And even worse than that, he can see how some simple changes could have actually enabled you to stay within budget and on timescales. The trouble is nobody asked him, and the specification was signed off without ever really consulting him. But he knuckles down and he gets on with his work, and he produces a website the best he can within the budget and timescales allowed to him. And then he launched the website is launched onto a development server, and the content people are then brought into the scenario, and they're asked to fill in the gaps, to fill in the content. Now, the trouble is a developer isn't necessarily the best person to create a system that a content editor can use. And so the content system is a lot harder to use than perhaps it should be. And if only the content editor had been consulted over this process, maybe they would have been able to suggest some changes that would have made the whole thing lots easier. Can you see what's happening here? This is what's called a traditional waterfall approach to project management, where one person passes on to the next and to the next and to the next. The trouble is the web is such a complex beast that it requires cooperation between so many different people in order to get the most effective solution. It's not enough just to pass it down the chain. These people need to be interacting with one another on an ongoing basis. Throwing stuff over the wall just does not work. A developer and a designer and a content editor should be involved in the specification stage up front. The developer should work with the designer to define the templates that are going to be produced before anybody ever sees them or signs them off, so that the developer knows that he can produce them. Equally, the content editor should be working with the developer to establish the best system possible to make updating and adding content to the website super easy and super efficient. So all of these different people need to be working together, but it just doesn't happen in a traditional project management technique. But that's not where the problem stops with traditional project management. There's also this boom and bust cycle of redesign. So if you look at expenditure over the period of a few years, as you can see on this timeline, the yellow line represents expenditure. So every time there's a redesign, there's a massive amount of expenditure, both in terms of finance and also effort. And then in between that period of time, the amount of effort and expenditure drops off to nearly zero. Very little is done other than basic maintenance and content updates. Now this creates a problem because our yellow line can represent something other than just effort and expenditure. It can also be about effectiveness. And actually there's something which I call the threshold of effectiveness. And that's the moment that when the website is first launched, it's super effective. It's at its optimal. The design looks great, the technology is running well, the content is up to date. And then what happens is, after the redesign, because there's so little effort associated with the project, you see a decline in the website's effectiveness. It becomes less and less effective as the design begins to look not particularly up to date. And the technology is dated as well because new technology has come along that's even better. And so then you also have a situation where your content isn't really updated as much as it should be, and old content's not removed, and the website becomes a little bit bloated. And in the meantime, your competition release a new website that's actually better than yours. So then you reach this point of which is a threshold of effectiveness. And this is the point where really the organization and the people in the organization become quite almost ashamed of the website. They stop telling people about it. They stop pointing people at it because actually their competition's website is so much better. And actually the content's out of date. And actually the design looks a bit rubbish now. So it means that probably 50% of the life cycle of a website is totally ineffective. Nobody is being referred to the website. And what happens is when the website kind of reaches this critical point, the bottom of the trough, when suddenly somebody in senior management goes, I am fed up with the website being totally ineffective without us using it. And so then we go through another redesign and the whole thing is repeated. But as you can see from that line, the yellow line, actually a huge proportion of your website's time is spent being fairly ineffective, where people don't really want to refer customers to it. So that is part of the problem. So what we're talking about is between these periods of redesign, we've got a period of time of ineffectiveness, a time where there's a lack of activity on the website. But more than that, there's a lack of vision and leadership. Periodic redesigns where you're doing nothing but maintenance in between means the website is rarely going to operate at optimal performance. But also a project-orientated approach means that most of the time your website is going to lack strong vision, strong strategy and strong leadership. The project mentality fails to address ongoing issues that your website needs: policies, procedures, strategies, governance. Because the problem is that although your website may be periodically redesigned, the majority of the functions of your business aren't going through this boom and bust. You're constantly investing in marketing. You're constantly looking to recruit people. You're constantly having to service existing customers. And so if the website isn't managed in the same way, it's not going to be integrated into these other marketing services. These other services, including marketing, including recruitment and customer service. So it's actually not working at its optimal, even setting aside the investment of time and energy, because it's just not integrated into the rest of the company. There's no strong strategy, there's no strong leadership, and there's no real governance going on. But things get worse with the traditional project management approach in this kind of boom-bust cycle. So here's our boom-bust cycle again. As you can see there, when we're redesigning the website, there's huge expenditure in time and effort into getting it to look great. And then when the website's launched, that then suddenly tails off into nothing. Okay? But there's a problem with this. And the problem is that actually it's only post-launch that we learn more about users. As users are starting to use the website more and interacting with it more, then we can start to see what they really want and what they really need. The problem is that working through a series of projects, there is a lack of focus on user needs. Projects are concerned with delivering pre-agreed specifications, which are more often like a wish list of requirements than they are anything to do with user needs. And certainly, at most, they're best guesses about what users want because we're not observing them post-launch. So as you can see, there are lots of problems with the traditional project management approach. So what's our alternative? Well, don't fret. There is a proven approach, a better approach that's been used on websites like gov.uk, and that other website is surrey.ac.uk. These are big organizations that have got a big tradition of project management because they're very bureaucratic organizations. Yet in both of these cases, a radically different approach to project management has been adopted that has brought about phenomenal success on both of these websites. Let's take, for example, gov.uk. Doesn't look like the most pretty website in the world, does it? But then it's a government website. They don't need to market or sell at you. All they need to do is create a very utilitarian, easy to use website. And this website does that extraordinarily well. In fact, so well that it won the Design of the Year award, which is the most prestigious design award you can get. And it was the first time a website had ever achieved that, and it beat out the Shard in London, and it also beat out the Olympic Flame to win that award. And it won the award partly because of the way that it's managed and the way it was created. This website could not be as good if it hadn't have used this radically different project management approach. So, what does that approach include? Well, there are kind of 4 components for success that we're going to look at in the remains of this presentation. Those are becoming user-focused, creating a single empowered digital team, working incrementally, and establishing policies and procedures. So let's work through those, and hopefully by the end you'll see how this is such a better way of working when it comes to the web. So first of all, becoming user focused, right? You will find that web designers bang on about this all the time, that we need to become user focused. And for us in the web design community, it's so amazingly obvious it doesn't go without saying. But the reality is not everybody works in the web design community, and so I'm going to take a moment to explain why being user-focused is so important. And I'm going to try and give you business reasons rather than kind of designy ones. First of all, it will reduce your costs. If you are building precisely what users want and need, you avoid building functionality that is not required, and that saves you money. Right? So being user focused will keep you on the right track and reduce your costs. Secondly, it will increase your effectiveness. If you're building what users actually want and require, then you will increase customer satisfaction, and that will increase your conversion rate. And we should all be worried about our conversion rate, even if we're not a website that sells stuff in e-commerce. Even if your conversion is convincing people to take part in a campaign, or to recruit students, or to use a contact us form, or whatever your conversion rate will be, being user focused will increase the likelihood of achieving that. And finally, it will provide criteria for inclusion. For example, academics in the academic world, they will often in a university demand certain types of content to be added to a site, whether or not it's appropriate to users. Senior management do this in the corporate sector as well, don't they? They come along and they demand, we need this on the website, and they stamp their fists. But the trouble is, that's probably, can you stamp your fists? You can you? You know what I mean. But the problem with that is that that may not be relevant content. And if you start getting everyone in the organization user focused, you will find that being what a user wants or doesn't want becomes a criteria for inclusion. It will filter out the rubbish. It will mean that you're only producing the best kind of content. So, how do you become user focused? Well, do you know what? It's really, really simple. And it all starts with a post-it note. It's that simple. Something called a user card. And a user card is a basic way of defining what it is that people want to do on your website. And as you can see, it consists of 3 parts. As a, insert the type of user, their role. So, as a, whatever. I want to, and the task they want to do, so that, and what their ultimate goal is. So I'll give you another higher education example, right? As a prospective student, I want to look at courses at this university, what courses this university offer in a particular subject area, so that I can decide whether to include this university in my short list of places to attend. Okay? So that is a user card. Deadly simple to produce. But that single-handedly will transform the way your projects are managed and the effectiveness of your site. See, the great thing about user cards is that they are something tangible that you can test. You can test whether or not they are effective. Okay? And you can see whether you are succeeding on the website or failing. They provide a criteria for working out whether you have delivered an effective website. But I'm going to come on to more about user cards in a moment, but I just want to go away from that and look at the idea of creating a single team. I will return to user cards. So this is another really important aspect of creating an effective website and managing your project slightly differently. In a lot of organizations, things look something like this. Again, I've used a higher education example just for consistency. Okay, so you have lots of departments, in the university's case, schools, you've got comms, information services, all these different groups across the organization. Then the web team lives somewhere within that, usually in information services, kind of IT department. But then you'll have other people, maybe developers that sit in a separate part of the IT department. And then you'll have people that should be contributing to the web spread out in various comms functions and marketing and stuff like that. In a university, you'll also find people in the individual schools as well that have got some experience to contribute to the website. And then on top of that, within the schools, you have individual departments with yet more people that can contribute value to the website. In other words, people are spread out across the organization, and this makes communication hard. There are lots of divided priorities and conflicting priorities and no real leadership, because the web team is mainly tactical. They're mainly doing maintenance things. They're seen as a service that's used by the rest of the organization to kind of make little changes to the website. It's the wrong organization. What you need is a single empowered web team. What you need to do is move people from various parts of the organization across into a centralized web team. Okay, so for a start, what you're doing is you're moving that web team out of information services and establishing it as an independent working group. You're moving team members from across the departments and schools and faculties or comms or wherever else into that web team. Okay. Now that doesn't mean you couldn't have some members that are still working remotely in departments, but most people will be moved into your centralized web team. Now, what's quite interesting is you could still have those people reporting into their original departments. I'm not saying you need to reorganize the entire organization just so you can have an independent web team. That web team can be a separate working group where all the members of staff are still attached to their original departments. In fact, that actually works quite well because it means that those departments are being drawn in and getting to play a part in the web team rather than just effectively creating another departmental silo. So you can still have them reporting into wherever they are, but they become this working group that operates independently of any other department within the organization. Then what you need to do is establish a strong digital lead who owns digital and can set the agenda. This is a person that needs to have the authority and seniority to establish a kind of strong working group that can make decisions about strategy without having to consult everybody over every little decision. And most importantly, have got the authority to say no. Say, no, we're not going to include that in the website. No, we're not going to go down that approach. Now, you might think, hang on, that begins to make me quite nervous because you have this one individual that's got a lot of power and a lot of authority. But I'm not saying he shouldn't have oversight. You can produce something called a responsibility assignment matrix that basically has different people within the organization that are responsible for the day-to-day production work of doing, branding or content creation or content removal. You can have somebody that's accountable in those different areas, normally your digital lead. But then there will be a group of people that are consulted about what's going on in those different areas. And notice what's going on here. We're not just creating an oversight group that kind of just oversees everything that the digital team is doing, because you get into a bizarre situation there where that somebody from IT who knows nothing about branding or design is being asked to sign off on the look and feel of the website, and that's just insanity. Instead, what we've got is the right people with the right skills being consulted over the right issues. So we've got, marketing and branding people being consulted on online branding, on design work. But when it comes to things like a CMS or a technical implementation, then you're talking to the IT team rather than to design and marketing and those kinds of people. Make sense? Okay. Well, I promised that I would come back to the subject of user cards, and that crops up when we get onto the subject of working incrementally. And this is our third secret to success. Okay, so essentially, you remember those user cards earlier? Well, what we need to do now is create a prioritized stack of them. We'll have created a lot of different user cards, for all of the different ways of, all the different tasks that users want to do on the site. And those now need to be stacked into a big list of prioritized cards. Now, how you prioritize them is up to you. If you're a very hierarchical organization where you've got people that can make decisions, then they should organize those cards on business objectives. You know, what are the most important users out of that group that we need to meet? Which users are most valuable to the organization? We need to meet their needs first and then come to the other ones later. If, however, you're a more democratic organization where different people have different authorities and things are a little bit more complicated, then you might want to put these cards online somewhere and let people vote them up and down in terms of which ones are more crucial to the business. The point is you end up with a prioritized list of cards. Now that becomes your traditional specification, your technical specification. This is what we want to achieve on the website. But notice we haven't necessarily defined how we're going to achieve that. We haven't defined functionality here. We've defined tasks. Now what your web team will do is they will work incrementally through that list from top to bottom, and they will work out what needs to be done on each of those tasks. So they'll work through a series of sprints, a series of short working sprints, probably lasting 2 weeks maybe. So they will select however many of those cards they feel that they can produce within one of those sprints. They will go through those cards, they will look at the tasks, and they will establish what functionality and what content needs creating in order to meet the needs of that task. So they will go through a definition process defining what the success criteria for each task is, what functionality for each task will need to be, what content needs creating. And then they will build that. And once they've built that, they will then put it online somewhere and they will test and monitor it. They will see how users get on with that. Then once that sprint has been finished, they go back to the original list, and then they pick the next few off of the list and rinse and repeat, going through the cycle again and again. Now the secret to this is that anybody at any stage can be adding more cards to the list, and those will then be prioritized in the proper place in the order. But it means that you constantly can add new cards as you think of new things. And that's the key. Trying to think of everything up front and create a big specification is very, very difficult to do. So this allows you to add new cards to the bottom of the list on a continual basis. And they may even be pushed up the list if they're considered business critical. But by working incrementally, you can constantly add new tasks into the stack. You can add new functionality, you can add new content, and you can test and monitor that on an ongoing iterative basis. And this continues all of the time. There isn't an end to the project. When the website instead passes through a series of phases. Here's an example of the kind of phases that are used at gov.uk. So there'll be a short discovery phase up front to make sure that you know everything that you need to. Then what you do is you'll do the top set of cards, the most important user tasks that need to be completed on the website, and build those. Those will become your alpha prototype. Those are your chance to really test the key things that need doing. Then over time you will expand that into a beta, and that will go into a live environment where real users can be shown that site and can start testing it. So for example, you might want to, on your existing website, put a banner that says, hey, check out our beta and why not try it? And then you can get real feedback from real users trying this beta site. And then a point will come and when you want to go live. Now that won't be set at any particular milestone. There won't be any kind of deadline that has arbitrarily been created. The decision about whether to go live or not will be based on the point where your new website is better than what you currently have. When it's better, then it can be made live. But that is not the end of the journey when it goes live. The same, you continue on with that investment on an ongoing basis. Now, it's not going to be as big an investment as the periodic redesigns, because you're not ever throwing out what went there before. You're just improving it and iterating it on a continual basis. So instead of having that yellow boom and bust line we looked at earlier, it will be this consistent development of continually improving and enhancing your website through testing, through iteration on an ongoing basis. So effectively, what you will have in your redesign, and this will probably be the last redesign you ever do, remember, because we're going to go for ongoing development from now on, so you won't need to have this big redesign where you throw things out. But in this last redesign cycle, you essentially will be running your existing site alongside your new site. And as you develop your new site through a series of rapid sprints, it will pass through an alpha phase and a beta phase. And eventually the new site will go live and replace that existing site. And then an ongoing program of iterative development will happen. So those are why those user cards are so important, because they become the specification on which you work. Okay, and finally, I want to look at establishing policies and procedures. A fundamental part of the process that is often missed with redesigns is creating the policies and procedures that will manage your website on an ongoing basis, year in and year out. And I just want to look at a few of what those could be. And they will naturally evolve out of this kind of iterative development process. So you don't need to establish these necessarily all up front. Some of them will come out naturally. Some of them will need to be developed up front in that discovery phase that I mentioned earlier. An example of that is your business objectives. This is fundamental stuff, people. Establishing business objectives is so important. Why does the website exist? What is it there to achieve? And yet so often these are not put in place before you begin the process. Why is this so important? Well, it creates consistency. A set of business objectives agreed by all ensures that the digital strategy is heading in a consistent direction and isn't being shoved off on tangents just because somebody in senior management comes along and stamps their foot. Secondly, it helps again to filter your ideas, just like creating those user cards did. Having a defined set of business objectives means that when people suggest content or functionality that doesn't support one of those business objectives, it can be safely rejected with a solid premise of why it's being rejected. And finally, it provides accountability. Business objectives can be turned into measurable success criteria, and so you can check how the web team is performing, whether the website is succeeding in its goals. So one of the policies and procedures you must put in place before you begin anything is your business objectives. But I said other ones evolve out of the process of producing the website. And an example of that is creating a consistent user experience. BBC produced something called the Global Experience Language, which defines how their website should work visually. You know, what's the typography like? What's the grid like? What's the masthead like? You know, what panels do they use in their design? All of those kinds of things. And that should evolve out of the design process. And that will set standards that will ensure a consistent look and feel across your site. Another of these standards that should come out is a tone of voice standard. How are you going to write and speak on the website? What tone of voice are you going to use in specific situations? Because so often websites end up with this fractured tone of voice where different people have written content for different parts of the site. But those are just the tip of the iceberg. Actually, there is a massive list of things that you can create. Accessibility policies, content approval policies, policies for removing content, development standards, testing requirements, social media policies. All of these things should evolve and come out of this empowered web team. One last example that I want to give you of a kind of policy and procedure, just to kind of give you a sense of why this is so important, is something called the fat ass footer solution. This has been implemented on the Surrey website. So often things like people come along and they complain about the homepage, don't they? Internal stakeholders go, why is my content not on the homepage? And a lot of the time it comes down to just an argument and who can shout the loudest as to what content gets on the homepage. And that's not a policy or a procedure, is it? That's just people shouting. Surrey have come up with their fat ass footer solution to this problem, where essentially if somebody thinks their content should be featured on the homepage, there is a procedure in place for dealing with that. First of all, that content is linked to from a fat ass footer, a really big footer that you can see on their website. And that footer is universal across the whole site. So it gives somebody prominence across every single page of the website. And then what happens is they monitor the click-through rate on that particular link. And if that link gets a certain threshold of click-throughs, if it is seen to be really popular content, then it gets promoted to the homepage. So that is an example of a policy which will take the kind of subjectiveness and the argument out of what content appears on the homepage. But equally, you can create policies that decide a threshold for when content should be removed from the site. There's all kinds of policies and procedures that need to be put in place for an effective organization or website. And the trouble is, a traditional project doesn't create those kinds of policies because there's no established ongoing team in place that's got ownership over the strategy for your website and your digital assets. So that's about it. That's all I wanted to say. Essentially, traditional project management doesn't work for the web, but there is a better way, a way that is user focused, a way that creates a single web team that's empowered and equipped to do their job effectively, a way of working incrementally to slowly improve the website over time rather than having these periodic redesigns which are boom and bust, where the website is wonderful at one point and useless at the next. And finally, a way that can create policies and procedures that are effective. So hopefully you found this a really useful presentation and it's challenged your preconceptions about how a website should be managed and a web project should be managed. And if you want help implementing any of these, then just get in contact with me, paul@boagworld.com, and I will be glad to help out.